So, welcome to part 3. So, we ended off discussing that there's 4 owners, not 2. There's 2 different things that can be locked. The content can be locked, and the devices can be locked down. Very interesting quote. Discuss those, again, those 2 different sets of things to be concerned with was Stuart Baker, who was then the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Assistant Secretary on Policy. Speaking to a group of copyright holders in 2005, right around the context of the Sony rootkit, that massive wealth-destroying activity from Sony, he said it's very important to remember that it's your intellectual property. It is not your computer. And in the pursuit of protection of intellectual property, it's important not to defeat or undermine the security measures that people need to adopt these days. So this is in the case of the Department of Homeland Security reprimanding Sony and other vendors like them of causing national security problems, threats to things considerably more harmful than copyright infringement. I mean, I'm not going to suggest that copyright infringement has absolutely no harm whatsoever, but we're talking about paper cuts versus amputation when we're talking about the level of harm that is being done in the pursuit of stopping copyright infringement. So some additional problems with again, the 4-owner narrative, where we discuss the software and the hardware as well as the copyright holders and the audiences of those works. So all the problems that are discussed in the 2-stakeholder narrative still apply. So those 30 days of DRM that Michael Geist discussed, those problems are real and need to be dealt with. But that is just the beginning of the problems once you realize that there's 4 stakeholders, not just 2. There's constitutional problems. Law professors were discussing contract law and whether or not that extension, that inflating what you can do under contracts to essentially be considered copyright is a constitutional problem. But as soon as you start talking about these and realizing those 2 different stakeholders, you then start asking questions about property law. I own this physical device. I own the hardware. Well, that's property law, like contract law, is provincial jurisdiction. Does the federal government have the jurisdiction to essentially decide that yes, property law exists, except in the case of digital technology, where someone claims that by revoking someone's property rights, their copyright can be protected. And I say claim because there's really no evidence to say that any of these measures reduce copyright infringement. But it is copyright that's being used to justify infringements of technology property rights and laws which protect those infringements of property rights. And again, we're talking about property rights. We're talking about provincial law, not federal law. Does the federal government have the jurisdiction to be playing with those things? So the control is in the hands of the people who control the keys. In the case of these, it's the device manufacturer, in this case, the most relevant previous owner of the device, that retains the keys. It's not the copyright holder. The copyright holder may have authorized a lock to be put on their content such that their content would only be interoperable with locked devices, but they don't control the devices. They don't write the software that runs on the devices. It's the software authors that are essentially deciding all of the use controls, all of the controls that will be on uses of works. So is it really the copyright holders that are being given the control at all? We need to discuss the interests and the conflicts of interest of software authors. So I'm a software author. More important than copyright to me is my ability to write software and to install that software on someone's computer. If someone else can't choose what software runs on their computer, how can they possibly choose to run my software? So far worse than any amount of copyright infringement that could harm me, and yes, copyright infringement could harm me, having someone other than the owners of computers deciding what software can and cannot run on those computers, that harm is much greater. Again, I'm not apologizing for copyright infringement. I'm just suggesting that there are problems far worse than copyright infringement, where copyright is being abused to justify this worst harm. So security. Again, we talked about security earlier and how it's all about ensuring that only authorized software is running and ensuring that only authorized persons can access the computer, remotely or on the computer itself. Well, how can the owner of a computer who has locks that were put on by a previous owner, possibly the manufacturer, secure their computer? Well, they can't, because there is an unauthorized entry automatically, which is the previous owner. That previous owner is the entity that is controlling what software runs on the computer. The owner is not the person that can control that. Regardless of what the owner tries to do, that holder of those keys can circumvent all of that, wander in any flaws in their security, and of course they have completely different motivations to the owner as far as security is concerned, but it's what they want the computer to do that ends up is being what the computer does, not what the owner wants it to do. So you have privacy issues. You have the integrity of online transactions. I mean, think about that. You're doing a financial transaction, and the key holder, the previous owner, can intervene, and there's no way for you to know because you don't have control of the software that's on your computer. You cannot secure your own computer. Now think about that in the case of e-voting. I mean, there's this desire to do online voting. Well, you may have a screen that comes up on saying, and you may choose candidate B. Well, if the author of the software that's running on your computer, and you have no control over the software that's actually running on your computer, the manufacturer does, but if the manufacturer decides that they actually like candidate C, that's probably what your computer is going to instruct the vote to be. So the integrity of anything that you're doing with the computer becomes suspect when you have these third parties that are essentially in control of the computer. It becomes, they essentially become the legislators. They become the entities that pretty much decide any of these online transactions. And an issue that actually came up last week at the industry committee: technological protection measures can be abused to hide infringement. So again, we're talking about, say, encryption of the content. And you need to have the keys to decrypt the content, or in some way you have to circumvent the technical measure in order to access the content. Well, what if that content was yours and somebody else who was not the copyright holder and put a technical protection on it? It essentially means that the copyright holders, and in order to do forensics, in order to find out whether or not somebody else infringed their copyright, they have to circumvent the technical measure. It's a basic part of it. So technical measures are just as likely to be abused to enable copyright infringement as they could have been used to stop copyright infringement. And again, the more you dive into how this technology works, the harder and harder it is to understand how copyright holders, as opposed to the device manufacturers and the anti-competitive software authors, but to ask how regular copyright holders, non-software copyright holders, how they can possibly benefit from this.